On the morning of November 24th, 1899, a crowd pressed against a narrow two-story house at 144 Floyd Street in Brooklyn. They were not protesters or mourners. They were investors, hundreds of them, clutching deposit slips and demanding their money back. A week earlier, the front stoop had buckled under the weight of people lined up to hand over cash. Now the windows were dark and the doors were shut. Inside, the ledger showed more than $1 million had passed through the house. The man who collected it, a clerk barely past his 21st birthday, was already on a train bound for Canada. His name was William F. Miller. He was a young bookkeeper from Brooklyn, married with an infant child and active in his church. In the spring of 1899, he stood before the Christian Endeavor Society at the Tompkins Avenue Congregational Church and made a quiet proposal to a few friends. He had access, he said, to inside information from the stock market. Anyone who gave him $10 would receive 10% back every single week. The arithmetic was staggering. 10% a week compounded across a year came to roughly 520%. Respectable bonds at the time paid about 6% for the entire year. A few of his Sunday school friends took the offer. The next week, exactly as promised, Miller paid them their 10%, they told others. Miller added a clever incentive. Bring in a new depositor and earn a 5% commission on whatever that person handed over. Now every satisfied customer became a recruiter, fanning out across Brooklyn and beyond. Miller did not invest a cent in the stock market. He simply took money from new arrivals and used it to pay the people who had come before. The newspapers, watching the crowds, began calling the young man the boy Napoleon of finance. The operation took over the house at 144 Floyd Street. Miller hired dozens of clerks and errand boys to handle the flood of cash. Depositors arrived from across the city and through the mail from far beyond it. He called the enterprise the Franklin Syndicate and printed circulars promising the same impossible returns to anyone who would write in. By the autumn, the money was no longer a trickle. In October and November alone, the syndicate took in more than $620,000. On a single ordinary day, tens of thousands of dollars in small bills crossed the counter. By police estimate, the Franklin Syndicate eventually counted around 12,000 depositors. They were not the wealthy. They were clerks, shopkeepers, widows, servants, and laborers, the kind of people who had never owned a share of anything and now believed they had found a doorway into easy wealth. Many did not withdraw their 10% at all. They left it in to compound, watching the figures grow on paper, reinvesting the very interest that existed only as an entry in Miller's books. It was the engine that kept the machine alive. As long as faith held and money flowed in, no one needed to be paid in full. Every scheme of this kind carries the seed of its own end, because it must always take in more than it pays out. As autumn deepened, the newspapers that had once marveled at the boy Napoleon turned skeptical. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle and others began asking how any honest enterprise could pay 500%. Editorials warned readers plainly that the arithmetic was impossible and that ruin was coming. Miller's own church had already expelled him. Yet the warnings, for a time, only drew larger crowds, as if the publicity itself were proof that the syndicate was real. Into this moment stepped a lawyer named Robert Ammon. Years earlier, Ammon had been a labor leader, and by 1899 he had become a fixer and counsel for men in difficult positions. He attached himself to Miller as legal advisor and quiet partner. As pressure mounted, Ammon's advice was simple: move the money. In the final weeks, roughly $250,000 passed from the Franklin Syndicate into Robert Ammon's hands. Money that would never find its way back to the depositors. Miller, by contrast, seemed strangely convinced the scheme could run forever and set almost nothing aside for himself. The collapse came quickly. On November 21st, Miller was arrested on a libel complaint, a small legal blow that shattered the spell. Word spread that the boy Napoleon was in trouble, and the faith that had sustained everything evaporated overnight. By November 23rd, the crowds at 144 Floyd Street were no longer depositing. They were demanding refunds. The line stretched down the block. Clerks paid out what they could until the cash on hand ran dry. The Franklin Syndicate had taken in over $1 million. When the police later opened the safe, they found about $4,500 and a stack of worthless transit company shares. Miller fled north to Montreal, slipping across the border while the wreckage smoldered behind him. For weeks he lived as a fugitive in the Canadian city, among its stone churches and busy commercial streets, hoping the scandal would fade. It did not. In early February 1900, a New York police captain named James Reynolds tracked him to Montreal and arrested him. Miller waved the slow machinery of extradition and agreed to return to Brooklyn to face the people he had ruined and the courts that awaited him. The trial opened in April 1900. The prosecution laid out the simple, damning truth. There had never been any inside information, never any real investment, only money shuffled from newcomers to old hands while the organizers skimmed the difference. The defense argued Miller had lacked criminal intent, that he had believed in his own dream. The jury was unconvinced. After several hours, they convicted William Miller of grand larceny. 2 weeks later, the court sentenced him to 10 years of hard labor at Sing Sing prison up the Hudson. He was still in his early 20s. Justice for the others came slowly and incompletely. Robert Ammon walked free for years, protected by the very legal skill that had served Miller. Not until June 1903 was Ammon convicted, and only of receiving stolen goods, a portion of the syndicate's loot. He drew 4 years, the maximum the law then allowed, and was released by 1907 to resume his practice. The depositors fared worst of all. Of more than $1 million taken in, the authorities recovered only about $13,000. The 12,000 investors saw, at best, a few pennies on each dollar they had surrendered. Miller's own story took a quieter turn. His health failed in prison, and in 1905, with tuberculosis cited, Governor Frank Higgins commuted his sentence. He had served roughly 5 years of the 10. Released and chastened, the former boy Napoleon settled into ordinary life. He worked in a grocery store on Long Island and lived under his wife's family name. The newspapers gave him a new nickname that suited the reformed man better than the old one. They called him Honest Bill. Then, 2 decades later, history rhymed. In the summer of 1920, a Boston promoter named Charles Ponzi was taking in millions with a scheme built on the same machinery Miller had used, paying old investors with new money and promising returns no honest business could deliver. A reporter sought out the aging grocery clerk for his opinion. Miller, who had run the original con, studied Ponzi's numbers and offered a line that has outlived them both. "I may be rather dense," he said, "but I cannot understand how Ponzi made so much money in so short a time." Days later, Ponzi's empire collapsed. The name attached to the swindle would be Ponzi's. The blueprint had been Miller's all along.